25,000 feet over Berlin, the air outside the canopy is 60 degrees below zero, and the young man in the cockpit can see his own breath freezing on the inside of the glass. Below him, strung out for miles, are the heavy bombers he was sent to protect, hundreds of them. And for the first time in this war, they are not alone over the capital of the Third Reich. He is flying a P-51 Mustang. He has enough fuel to be here, over Berlin, and enough to get home again. And that one simple fact, that an American single-engine fighter can now go all the way to the enemy's front door and back, is about to break the German Air Force in half. It is March 1944. And what this pilot does not know, what almost none of the men in those bombers know, is that the airplane keeping them alive that morning had already existed, in every way that mattered, for a year and a half. Its performance had been measured, written down, and filed away 16 months before it ever appeared over Germany. The engine that made it deadly at high altitude had been bolted in and flown in the autumn of 1942. The reports had crossed the right desks. The numbers were not in dispute. And in the gap between the day this airplane was proven and the day it finally arrived, thousands of American bomber crewmen died in the skies over Europe, flying deep into Germany without a fighter that could stay with them, because the men who decided such things had looked at the answer and set it aside. This is the story of that gap, not the story of a great airplane. You have heard that one. This is the story of the year and a half that great airplanes spent grounded by doctrine, by budgets, and by the pride of an institution that had convinced itself it did not need what it was being offered. It is the story of a plane that could have saved them, and the men who were, in the coldest sense of the words, too late. I want to be careful and fair here, because the easy version of this story names a villain and moves on, and the truth is harder than that. But by the end, I think you will agree with the man who ran the whole Air Force when he sat down after the war and admitted, in his own memoir, that the delay was nobody's fault but their own. Ask most people who know their history what the P-51 Mustang was, and you will get the same answer, and it is not wrong. The best all-around fighter of the Second World War. The airplane that escorted the bombers to Berlin and won air superiority over Germany before the invasion of Normandy. The plane that let the daylight bombing campaign finally work. All of that is true. The Mustang earned every bit of it. But a legend is a story with the hard parts filed off. And the hard part of this one is a question almost nobody asks. If this airplane was so obviously the answer, why did it take so long to use it? Why were American boys still going down in flames over Germany in the autumn of 1943, unescorted, when the fighter that could have flown with them had already flown, already been tested, already been written up in glowing reports on both sides of the Atlantic? To understand how late the Mustang was, you have to understand how early it actually existed. And that takes us back to a moment when the United States Army had almost nothing to do with it at all. In the spring of 1940, France was falling, and Britain stood next. A British purchasing commission came to the United States looking for fighters, any fighters, and they walked into a company in Inglewood, California, called North American Aviation. They did not come to buy a new design. They came to ask North American to build somebody else's fighter under license, the Curtiss P-40, because they needed numbers and they needed them fast. The president of North American was a man named James Kindleberger, known to everyone as Dutch, and Dutch Kindleberger made a decision that a more cautious man would not have made. He told the British he could design them a better fighter from scratch, faster than he could retool his factory to build the Curtiss. It was very close to a bluff. But his chief designer, a quiet, German-born engineer named Edgar Schmood, had been carrying exactly such an airplane in his head for years. What Schmood and his team drew was, by the standards of 1940, a quiet revolution. A wing shaped to a brand new low-drag design, the laminar flow wing, that slipped through the air more cleanly than anything then flying. A radiator tucked under the belly in a way that actually recovered a little thrust from its own hot air, a trick of physics called the Meredith effect. The prototype was called the NA-73X, and North American rolled it out in 100 and some days. A feat that gets exaggerated in the retelling because the airframe sat waiting on its engine, but a feat all the same. It first flew on October 26, 1940. You will often hear that North American designed and built the whole airplane in 117 days, and it makes a wonderful story, but it is worth being precise, because precision is the whole point of this channel. That figure refers to rolling the airframe out of the shop. The airplane then sat waiting weeks longer for its engine before it could actually fly. It was still a staggering achievement, a clean sheet fighter from paper to prototype in a matter of months, the work of Schmood and a small team driving themselves without rest. But the legend rounds off the edges, and this story is about the edges. The British loved it. They named it the Mustang. And here's the detail that decides everything that follows. This airplane was designed to a British requirement, paid for with British money, born entirely outside the United States Army's own program. It did not come up through the American system. It had, as one man would later put it in a line I will come back to, no parent at home to love it. That single fact, that the Mustang was an orphan inside the American military, is the seed of the entire tragedy. Because an institution protects its own children first. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and some of you have personal connections to it, and I want to do it justice. Now, back to the airplane nobody in the Army wanted to raise. The Mustang had one problem, and it was a serious one: its engine. The early Mustang used an American engine, the Allison V1710, and the Allison was built to an Army specification that assumed high-altitude power would come from a turbo supercharger, the way it did on the twin-engine P-38 Lightning. But you could not easily fit a turbo into a sleek, single-engine airplane like the Mustang, so the Allison and the Mustang had only a simple single-stage supercharger, and a supercharger is nothing more than an air pump that force-feeds the engine to make up for the thinning air as you climb. Below about 15,000 feet, that pump was enough, and down low the Mustang was astonishing, faster than a Spitfire, far faster than the P-40 it had replaced on the drawing board. But above 15,000 feet, the air thinned out quicker than the little pump could keep up with, and the engine ran out of breath. The higher you went, the more ordinary the Mustang became. And the war over Germany, the war of the heavy bombers, was fought at 25,000 feet and higher. So the finest airframe of the war spent its first 2 years doing work far below its potential. The British used their Allison Mustangs down on the deck for armed reconnaissance and ground attack, skimming over occupied France, taking photographs and shooting up trains. The first Mustang to down a German aircraft did it low over Dieppe in August of 1942, and it was a fine low-altitude fighter. The Americans, when they finally bought some, could not even find fighter money for them at first, so they were purchased out of attack aircraft funds and turned into a dive bomber called the A-36, with dive brakes on the wings. Think about that. The best fighter airframe in the world. And the United States Army bought its first big batch as a dive bomber because that was the pot of money that happened to be open. I am not exaggerating for effect. That is literally how it was funded. And it tells you exactly how much the institution understood what it was holding. Do not mistake the point. The Allison Mustangs and the dive bomber version, the A-36, were not failures. Down low, they were superb, and they fought hard in the Mediterranean and over Burma, strafing and dive bombing and flying the dangerous low reconnaissance nobody else wanted. Men flew them well and died in them bravely. But every one of those airframes was a reminder of what was being wasted. The finest high-altitude potential in the sky was being spent hugging the ground because the engine up front could not breathe where the bombers needed help. It was like owning a racehorse and using it to pull a plow. The horse does the job. It is still the wrong job. Everything changed because of one test flight and one man's curiosity. In April of 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker, known as Ronnie, was invited to fly one of the Allison Mustangs the British were evaluating. He went up for barely half an hour, and he came down convinced that he had just flown the finest airframe he had ever handled, saddled with the wrong engine. Harker wrote a memo the very next day. His idea was simple, and in hindsight, obvious. Take out the Allison, put in the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same two-stage supercharged engine that made the Spitfire Mark IX such a monster at altitude. The Merlin had, in effect, two air pumps working in series, and it held its power far higher into the sky than the Allison ever could. At Rolls-Royce, an aerodynamicist named Witold Challier ran the numbers before anyone bent a bolt. His calculations said a Merlin Mustang would do something close to 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. That was not an improvement. That was a different airplane. That was, on paper, the best fighter in the world. And then they proved it. Rolls-Royce converted a handful of Mustang airframes to the Merlin, and the first of them flew in October of 1942. In America, North American did the same thing with a license-built Packard version of the Merlin, and their converted prototype flew on the 30th of November, 1942. The predicted numbers came true. The laminar flow wing that carried so much fuel so efficiently married to the Merlin that breathed at altitude, produced a fighter that could fight at 25,000 feet and still have the legs to go deep and come home. Now fix that date in your mind, because it is the hinge of this entire story, the end of 1942. That is when the Merlin Mustang stopped being an idea and became a measured, tested, documented fact. The reports existed. The performance was real. The airplane that would eventually go to Berlin had, in every meaningful sense, already been born. It would not fly its first combat escort mission for another full year. A year. Hold that. Because in that year, the men flying the bombers were about to pay a bill that somebody in an office had run up on their behalf. To understand why a proven answer sat on a shelf for a year, you have to go inside the mind of the institution that shelved it. And that mind had been formed, over more than a decade, at a schoolhouse in Alabama. Between the wars, American air power theory was worked out at the Air Corps Tactical School, and its central belief became almost a religion: the self-defending bomber. The idea was that heavy bombers, flying in tight formations, bristling with machine guns, could fight their way to any target in daylight and back without fighter escort. The bomber, in the famous phrase, would always get through. Fighters were for defense, for point interception. The notion that a little single-engine fighter could or should escort bombers 1,000 miles into enemy territory was dismissed again and again by board after board as unnecessary and probably impossible. The historian Tammy Davis Biddle, in her book Rhetoric and Reality in Air Warfare, traces how deeply this belief ran and how resistant it was to evidence. This was not stupidity. These were intelligent, dedicated officers. But they had built their careers, their budgets, and their entire theory of victory on the self-defending bomber, and a long-range escort fighter was not just unnecessary in their eyes. It was a threat to the whole idea. One senior officer, Lawrence Cuter, admitted it plainly after the war. He said, "We just closed our minds to it. The bomber was invincible. It is worth naming where this faith came from, because on this channel the doctrine is a recurring character. It grew out of the theories of air power prophets like the Italian Giulio Douhet and the American Billy Mitchell, and it was refined into a precise creed by a group of instructors at that Alabama schoolhouse who would later be called the Bomber Mafia. They believed sincerely that fleets of heavy bombers, striking an enemy's vital industries in daylight, could win a war almost by themselves, and that fighters were a secondary, almost primitive weapon. These were not fools. Several of them would rise to command the air war. But they had fallen in love with an idea, and a man in love with an idea is often the last man to notice when the idea starts costing lives. The escort fighter was not just a piece of hardware they overlooked. It was a rebuke to the theory they had staked their careers on, and that is a very hard thing for any group of proud people to accept. I want to be honest about something here, because this channel does not deal in cheap hindsight. In 1940 and 1941, no one in the world had a true long-range escort fighter, and plenty of serious people, including senior officers in the Royal Air Force, genuinely doubted one was even possible. A small fighter, the reasoning went, could never carry enough fuel to fly as far as a bomber and still turn and fight a defending interceptor that carried almost none. It was a reasonable fear. The tragedy is not that they doubted it in 1941. The tragedy is what they did and did not do after the doubt was answered at the end of 1942. Because by then, the answer had a name and it had a champion. And the champion could not get the machine to move. The champion was one of the more remarkable men in this whole story, Tommy Hitchcock. Before the war, he had been the most famous polo player in America, a genuine celebrity, and a fighter pilot in the First War. By the Second War, he was in his 40s, too old for a cockpit, and he was serving as an assistant air attaché at the American Embassy in London. From that seat, he saw the Merlin Mustang up close, flew it, and understood instantly what it meant. And he started sending reports home, trying to light a fire under Washington. It was Hitchcock who wrote the line that sums up this entire tragedy better than anything I could. He said the Mustang was, and I am quoting him, sired by the English out of an American mother and has no parent at Wright Field to appreciate and push its good points. Wright Field in Ohio was where the Army developed and bought its aircraft. And Hitchcock had put his finger on it exactly. The Mustang was an orphan. It had come from outside the family. And so, inside the material command that ran Wright Field, no one championed it, no one fought for it, no one lost sleep over getting it to the front. Hitchcock took his case to an old friend from the First War, Robert Lovett, who by now was Assistant Secretary of War for Air, one of the most powerful civilians in American air power. And Lovett listened. In the middle of 1943, Lovett came back from a trip to England convinced that the lack of long-range escort was becoming a catastrophe. At his urging, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, Henry Arnold, known as HAP, finally ordered the escort fighter problem studied seriously. That order went out at the end of June 1943. Read that date again? The end of June 1943. That is the first time the American Air Force studied the long-range escort problem with real urgency since the country had entered the war. 6 months after the Merlin Mustang had already been proven. And there is a detail buried in the official histories that I find genuinely hard to forgive. Part of what made a fighter go the distance was not just the engine. It was fuel tanks. External drop tanks that a fighter carries under its wings and drops when empty, and internal tanks to stretch the range further still. This was not exotic technology, it was plumbing. And yet the development of drop tanks had been neglected for years. Before the war, the Chief of the Air Corps had actually directed that combat aircraft not be fitted with droppable fuel tanks, on the grounds that they were a fire hazard. In February of 1942, Arnold ordered all-out development of auxiliary tanks. And then, buried under his fights over bomber production, he failed to follow it through. When the 8th Air Force in England asked for drop tanks in the autumn of 1942, according to the official record laid out by the historian William Emerson, they got essentially nothing. Requests went out and died. As late as August of 1943, the Materiel Command had to admit that no drop tanks were yet available in the combat theaters at all. When Arnold learned that his air commander in the Pacific, George Kenney, had gotten fed up and started manufacturing his own belly tanks locally, he was furious. He said, and this is in the record, "There's no reason in God's world why General Kenney should have to develop his own belly tanks. But that fury should have been aimed at a mirror. It was his own headquarters that had let the thing rot." There is even a moment where the Army, casting around for a long-range escort, poured effort and a letter of intent for 2,500 aircraft into a monstrosity called the XP-75, cobbled together from parts of other airplanes. It was a fiasco. It barely flew. 14 were built and the program was canceled. But here's the irony that tells you everything. The officer sent to evaluate that failed airplane, a man named Mark Bradley, came away convinced that the real answer was sitting right in front of them, the Mustang, and that all it needed was one more fuel tank behind the pilot to reach across Germany. He got that fuselage tank development started in the summer of 1943. The airplane had been ready. It was the will that was missing. And if this pattern sounds familiar to you, if you have ever watched an organization pour money and energy into some doomed pet project while the obvious answer sat ignored because it came from the wrong department, you are not imagining it. The pattern is older than any of us. It just usually does not get this many people killed. I want to be fair, because fairness is the only thing that makes a story like this trustworthy. Not every man at Materiel Command was a villain. The same office that dragged its feet had earlier used a clever counting trick to keep the Mustang line alive at all, when a general named Oliver Eccles and a fighter officer named Benjamin Kelsey funneled that dive bomber money into North American to keep the airplane in production during the lean years. Kelsey in particular comes across in the record as a man quietly fighting for this airplane the whole way through. Institutions are not cartoons. They contain the people trying to do the right thing, and the inertia trying to stop them, often in the same building, sometimes in the same person. Eccles himself shows up in the histories as both a protector of the Mustang early and an obstacle to the escort idea later, and both things can be true. But the sum of it, the thing the institution did as a whole, is not really in dispute, and we do not have to argue about it because the man at the very top settled the question himself. We will get to his confession. First, we have to count the cost of the waiting. While the escort fighter sat in the gap between proven and delivered, the men it was meant to protect flew into the heaviest air defenses on Earth, with no one to hold their hand past the German border. The short-range fighters they did have could not reach far into Germany. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a superb machine, rugged and heavily armed. But in 1943, even with early drop tanks, its combat radius was barely over 250 miles. It could take the bombers as far as the German frontier, somewhere around Aachen, and then, low on fuel, it had to turn for home. And the Germans knew it. They learned to wait. They would watch the escort peel away, and then they would fall on the naked bombers with everything they had for hundreds of miles all the way to the target and back. The Army did think it had another escort answer coming. Its name was the P-38 Lightning, that big twin-boomed, twin-engined fighter that could carry fuel for real distance. On paper, the Lightning should have been the deep escort, And this is part of why the Mustang felt unnecessary to the planners. They believed the P-38 would cover the gap. But over the brutal cold of northern Europe at high altitude, the early Lightnings suffered. Their engines threw fits in the deep cold, their cockpits froze, and in a hard-turning fight up high against a Messerschmitt 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190, the heavy twin was at a disadvantage. The P-38 did good and hard work in Europe, and it was magnificent in the Pacific, where the conditions suited it. But in the specific hell of high-altitude combat over Germany in 1943, it was not the answer they had counted on. So the presumed solution was quietly failing. At the same time, the real solution sat waiting. The planners had bet on the wrong airplane, and even as that bet went bad, they were slow to reach for the winning one already in their own hand. It is worth understanding exactly how the Germans killed unescorted bombers, because it was not luck, and it was not a fair fight. Once the American short-range fighters turned for home, the German controllers vectored their interceptors in with time to spare. They came at the bombers head-on, closing at a combined speed of better than 500 miles per hour, because the B-17 was least protected from dead ahead, and because a head-on pass gave the bomber gunners almost no time to react. They brought up twin-engine heavy fighters that stood off beyond machine gun range and lobbed heavy rockets into the tight formations, breaking the boxes apart so the single-engine fighters could pick off the stragglers. They attacked in relays, wave after wave, landing to refuel and rearm and then climbing back up, hour after hour, all the way in and all the way out. A bomber crew might face fighters for 2 hours without a real break. The tight defensive formation, the whole beautiful idea of massed guns protecting one another, helped, but it was never enough. And everyone who flew it knew it was never enough. What it needed was a friendly fighter riding alongside, and that fighter was sitting in California and Ohio, on the far side of a decision. On the 17th of August, 1943, the 8th Air Force sent its bombers deep into Germany to hit an aircraft plant at Regensburg and the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. It was a double strike, ambitious and far beyond fighter range. The bombers went in alone for most of the way. 60 heavy bombers were lost that day out of the force sent, and with them the better part of 600 young men, killed, captured, or missing in a single afternoon. 600. The institution's response to that catastrophe tells you how deep the doctrine ran. They did it again. On the 14th of October, 1943, a day the crews would forever call Black Thursday, the 8th went back to Schweinfurt. 291 B-17s set out. The escorts turned back at the border, as everyone knew they would, and the German fighters did what they had learned to do. When the count was finished, 60 of those bombers had been shot down outright. And by the fuller accounting some historians use, counting those written off as damage beyond saving, the loss ran to more than 80 aircraft out of 291. Roughly 1 in 5 never came home from the shoot-downs alone. One group, the 305th, sent 15 bombers and lost 13. Let me put a human floor under those numbers because they slide by too easily. Each of those B-17s carried 10 men. A ball turret gunner curled into a plastic sphere on the belly of the airplane, a 19-year-old with no room for a parachute where he sat, a tail gunner alone at the back, a bombardier, a navigator, a pilot the same age as a college senior. When a bomber went down, sometimes the whole crew got out, and often they did not. Donald Miller, in his history of the 8th Air Force called Masters of the Air, describes what these losses did to the squadrons, how a man would go to breakfast and find the beds of friends already being stripped, their belongings boxed, as if they had never existed. That was the price of the gap. Consider the arithmetic those men lived under. In that period, a bomber crewman in the 8th Air Force had to complete a tour of 25 missions before he could rotate home. And, in the worst stretches of 1943, the odds of surviving 25 missions were, by many honest reckonings, worse than even. The loss rate on a hard mission could run to 1 in 20, 1 in 10, sometimes far worse on a single terrible day, and you had to do it 25 times over. Historians have pointed out that a young man in a heavy bomber over Europe in that year faced worse odds than a Marine in the Pacific. And this channel has said that before, because it is one of the most staggering facts of the entire war. These were not reckless men. They were clerks and farm boys and college students who had been handed the most dangerous job in the American military and told that the formation would protect them, that the guns would be enough, that the bomber would get through. And every week the empty bunks said otherwise. There is a particular cruelty in the timing that I cannot get past. A young man who flew his missions in the late summer and autumn of 1943 and did not come back died in the exact window when the airplane that might have escorted him was finished, tested, and waiting for the order to go. Not a year away, not in a laboratory, finished. If he had flown the same target 6 months later, there would have been a Mustang off his wing the whole way. He did not have 6 months. He had October. That is what a bureaucratic delay looks like from inside a burning bomber, and it is why I cannot treat the word delay as something bloodless. Every month of it had a number, and the number was men. After Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force stopped. It simply could not go deep into Germany anymore. Unescorted daylight bombing of distant targets was suspended for months. The doctrine that the bomber would always get through had been tested against the Luftwaffe, and the Luftwaffe had won. And the airplane that could have changed that math was, at that very moment, coming off production lines, its performance proven for the better part of a year, waiting for a system that had finally, too late, begun to want it. Here's the part of the story that should make you angry and grateful at the same time. Because when the Mustang finally arrived, it did in a matter of weeks, almost exactly what its champions had promised it would do. The first Merlin Mustangs went into combat with an outfit that earned a nickname it kept forever, the Pioneer Mustang Group, formerly the 354th Fighter Group. They flew their first mission at the start of December 1943, and almost immediately, the impossible things started happening. American fighters began appearing over places in Germany where no Allied single-engine fighter had ever been able to reach and still get home. On the 11th of January 1944, a Mustang pilot named James Howard found himself, through the chaos of a fight, the only escort left, over a formation of bombers under heavy attack. Instead of running, he waded in alone and fought off a swarm of German fighters, single-handed for more than half an hour to protect the bombers behind him. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, but the deeper point of that day is simply that he was there at all, that far into Germany, in a fighter that could reach. Then came the mornings that broke the back of the German Air Force. By now, the Mustang carried an extra tank behind the pilot and big drop tanks under the wings, and its combat radius had stretched past anything the P-47 or the P-38 could manage. On the 4th of March, 1944, Mustangs escorted the heavy bombers all the way to Berlin for the first time, more than 500 miles from their bases in England, a round trip of over 1,000. 2 days later, they were back over the capital in force. For the German fighter pilots, who had built their whole defense around the certainty that American escorts had to turn back at the border, it was the beginning of the end. Their sanctuary was gone. The mission, 2 days later, on the 6th of March, 1944, was the one the record books remember, the first full-scale American raid on Berlin, and the Mustang groups went with it the whole way. The 357th Fighter Group, the first Mustang outfit assigned to the 8th Air Force itself, put its P-51s over the German capital. And among the young pilots learning their trade that spring were men who would become legends, like Bud Anderson and Chuck Yeager. It cost the Americans dearly that day, in bombers and in fighters both, because the Germans threw everything they had at those first Berlin raids. But that was exactly the fight the Americans wanted. Every time the Luftwaffe rose to defend the Reich, the Mustangs were waiting, and the exchange, over weeks, ran only one way. The bombers were the bait, the fighters were the trap, and the doctrine that had said the bomber would always get through was quietly replaced by a colder truth, that the bomber would get through because the fighter had cleared the way. And the new commander of the 8th Air Force understood exactly how to use it. When Jimmy Doolittle took over at the end of 1943, he changed one order that changed everything. The fighters had been chained to the bombers, forbidden to stray far from the formation. Doolittle cut them loose. He told them to range ahead, to hunt the German fighters wherever they could find them, in the air and on their own airfields. The Mustang's reach turned that order from a wish into a weapon. Now the escorts were not just shielding the bombers, they were hunting the Luftwaffe to death. For a while, the 3 American fighters worked as a relay, and it is a neat picture of the whole problem and its solution. The P-47 Thunderbolts, short-legged but plentiful, took the bombers out to the German border and a little beyond. The P-38 Lightnings, with more range, carried them deeper, and then the P-51 Mustangs took over for the long middle stretch, over the target, and back to where the Thunderbolts could pick the bombers up again for the ride home. Each fighter flew the leg it could fly, but only the Mustang could fly the leg that mattered most, the deep one, the one over the target where the German defenses were thickest. And as more Mustang groups arrived, they increasingly flew the whole distance themselves. The relay was a stopgap. The Mustang was the answer, and everyone in the air could see it. In late February of 1944, came the stretch the Americans called Big Week, a deliberate campaign to bomb the German aircraft industry and force its fighters up to defend it, where the Mustangs could kill them. The bombing did not destroy German aircraft production. In fact, aircraft production actually rose later that year. But that was never really the point, and here is the thing the raw production numbers miss. You can build all the fighters you want. You cannot build experienced pilots fast enough to replace the ones you are losing. The historians Donald Caldwell and Richard Muller, in their study The Luftwaffe over Germany, record that during Big Week, the German fighter force lost around 17% of its pilots, nearly 100 killed in a single week. That was the wound that did not heal. The men on the other side understood what was happening to them better than anyone. The German fighter general, Adolf Galland, said after the war that the appearance of long-range escort fighters over the Reich was the decisive factor in the defeat of the German day fighter force. And there is a story, told in various forms, that when Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, first saw American fighters over Berlin, or by some accounts over Hanover, he understood in that instant that the war was lost. Whatever the exact words, the meaning is true. The Germans had built their entire day defense on the certainty that the enemy fighters had to turn back at the border. When that certainty broke, so did they. Their veteran pilots, the irreplaceable ones, began to die faster than the schools could train replacements. And a fighter force that loses its experienced corps does not decline slowly. It collapses. By the spring of 1944, it was collapsing. By the 1st of April, 1944, the Americans had effectively won air superiority over Germany. And the proof came on the 6th of June. On D-Day, over the greatest invasion fleet ever assembled, the German Air Force was simply not there. Against many thousands of Allied sorties that day, the Luftwaffe managed only a few hundred. Donald Miller notes that it flew fewer than 250 sorties against the invasion. The sky over the beaches belonged to the Allies, and it belonged to them in large part because of an airplane that could finally clear the enemy fighters out of it. Think about the distance traveled in barely half a year. In October of 1943, the 8th Air Force could not fly deep into Germany at all without being torn apart. By June of 1944, its fighters owned the sky over the invasion beaches so completely that the German Air Force was a rumor. Same bombers, or what was left of them, same crews, or their replacements. The one thing that changed was that the fighters could finally go all the way, and were finally turned loose to hunt, one airplane and one order. That is how narrow the margin was between catastrophe and command of the air, and it is why the year and a half of delay is so hard to forgive. The fix was never far away. It was just late. I want to pause on how the Mustang actually did what the P-47 and the P-38 could not, because the audience for this channel knows airplanes, and the easy explanation you usually hear is wrong. The easy explanation is drop tanks. Just hang bigger tanks on it. But the P-47 got drop tanks too, and it still could not do what the Mustang did. The real answer is efficiency. The Mustang's laminar flow wing and clean design meant it slipped through the air, burning far less fuel to go the same distance. One set of figures from the test pilot and historian Jeffrey Ethel puts it starkly. The Mustang got something like 3 1/3 miles to the gallon. The big radial-engined Thunderbolt got less than 1 8/10. The Mustang was not just carrying more fuel, it was sipping it. That is why it could go to Berlin, and the others could not, and no amount of tanks bolted onto a thirstier airframe could close that gap. And this matters for the argument, because it means the Mustang's long-range potential was not some lucky accident discovered late. It was baked into the airframe from 1940. The efficiency was always there. All it ever needed was the right engine to let it fight where the bombers flew, and that engine was proven in it at the end of 1942. Everything after that was a choice, or failure to choose. A few things worth getting right, because I know many of you can already see these airplanes in your mind, and some of you have relatives who flew them. The engine that transformed the Mustang was a Rolls-Royce Merlin, but the ones in American-built P-51s were made under license in the United States by Packard. Packard built the engine, not the airframe, and I mention it only because I have seen that one garbled 100 times. The Mustangs that first went to Berlin in the spring of 1944 were the Razorback models, the P-51B and the P-51C, with the older framed canopy, wearing the white star on a blue disc with the white bars and the blue surround, the red having been taken off the national insignia months earlier. The bubble canopy, P-51D, that everyone pictures, the one in every photograph, came later that year. And those bold black and white invasion stripes you see on the D-Day airplanes were not painted on until the first days of June. A Mustang over Berlin in March did not wear them yet. These are small things. But they are the kind of small things that separate the men who lived this from the rest of us, and this channel does not get them wrong on purpose. It is worth a moment on how the range problem was actually solved, step by step, because it was not one magic tank. It was a stack of unglamorous fixes that had been available for the asking. First came proper external drop tanks, including a clever pressed paper tank, laminated from paper because aluminum was precious, that could hold 108 gallons and be thrown away once empty. Then came the fuel tank fitted behind the pilot, the one Mark Bradley had pushed for, adding 85 gallons inside the airframe itself. That rear tank came with a nasty quirk the pilots had to respect because a full tank behind the center of gravity made the airplane twitchy and dangerous to maneuver until you had burned it down, so the drill was to climb out and cross the channel on the rear tank, burn it off first, and only then go into combat properly balanced. It was fiddly. It was learnable. And together, these plumbing fixes turned a fine short-range fighter into one that could fly to Berlin more than 500 miles from base, fight, and come home. None of it was exotic. All of it could have been ready sooner. So we come back to the gap. The Merlin Mustang was proven at the end of 1942. It flew its first combat escort at the start of December 1943. It reached Berlin in March 1944. And in between lay Regensburg and the first Schweinfurt and Black Thursday and thousands of empty bunks. The hard question, the honest question, is this. Could it really have been there sooner? Could a different set of decisions have put Mustangs over Schweinfurt in October of 1943 and saved those crews? I have to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of question where it is easy to be a hero with hindsight. I promised you I would not do that. The most aggressive version of the argument, made by some writers with a strong point of view, claims the Mustang could have been over Germany 5 full months earlier, by the summer of 1943. I think that particular claim is too clean. Building an airplane in quantity, working the bugs out of a new engine and airframe combination, shipping it across an ocean, training the groups, none of that happens overnight, and the more careful historians know it. The most balanced treatment I know of the whole air superiority problem is The Study to Command the Sky by Stephen McFarland and Wesley Newton. And what it shows is that the delay was not one villain twirling a mustache. It was overdetermined. It was doctrine that did not want the airplane. It was a procurement system that treated an orphan design like an orphan. It was genuine, honest engineering doubt about whether escort was even possible, doubt that the British shared. It was the neglect of something as dull as fuel tanks. Pile all of that together and you get a year and a half. But here's the thing. You do not have to take my word for whether the delay was avoidable, because the one man with the most authority to judge it, and the most reason to make excuses, refused to make them. Henry Arnold ran the entire Army Air Forces. He was as responsible as any human being for how the air war was fought. And, after the war, in his memoir called Global Mission, published in 1949, he sat down and wrote this. He wrote that the long-range P-51 could have been in Europe rather sooner than it was, and that the reason it was not there sooner was the Air Force's own fault. His own fault. He said it plainly in his own book, with his own name on it. When the commanding general admits in print that his own service is to blame for the delay of the airplane that could have protected his own crews, I think we are allowed to believe him. That is not a critic's accusation. That is a confession. What would sooner have looked like, realistically? Probably not Mustangs over Schweinfurt in October. But, very plausibly, Mustangs over Germany in strength by the early winter of 1943, instead of the following spring, if the fuselage tank and the drop tanks and the production priority had been pushed the moment the Merlin airframe proved itself at the end of 1942. A few months. And in this war, a few months of proper escort over Germany was the difference between an air force that could go deep and one that had to stop. Measure those few months in the loss rate of the autumn of 1943, and you are measuring them in the thousands. That is the weight Arnold was carrying when he wrote that one honest sentence. I have gone back and forth on how hard to be about this, and I have landed here. I do not think anyone woke up in the morning wanting American boys to die. That is not the accusation. The accusation is smaller and, in a way, more damning because it is so ordinary. A great institution was handed the solution to its deadliest problem, and it did not run with it. It studied. It doubted. It protected its favorite theory and its favorite programs. It let a dull thing like fuel tank development drift for want of anyone whose career depended on it. And by the time it finally moved with urgency, the calendar had already been paid for in blood. There was no malice in it. There rarely is. That is the part worth sitting with, because the same slow machinery runs in peacetime too in every large organization, and it is only the stakes that change. Step back from the airplane for a moment, because this story is really about two things this channel comes back to again and again, and here they sit, braided together in a single tragedy. The first is what I call doctrine killing men. A beautiful theory, the self-defending bomber, built in peacetime by intelligent officers who had never flown a mission against a modern fighter defense. It was elegant. It was institutionally beloved. It justified the whole existence of an independent bombing force. And it was wrong, and the men who held it kept sending crews out under its assumptions long after the loss rates were screaming that it had failed. The doctrine did not just make the escort seem unnecessary. It made the escort almost unwelcome, because a bomber that needed a fighter to survive was an admission that the whole theory had a hole in it. The second is what I call politics killing competence, though in this case it is not a man who gets buried but a machine, and the men who die for it are strangers to it. The Mustang was the outsider. It came from the wrong place, through the wrong door, funded by the wrong country, championed by a middle-aged former polo player at an embassy instead of by a general at Wright Field. And so the system that should have seized it treated it with the slow indifference that institutions reserve for things that are not theirs, not hatred. Something worse in its way, neglect. And the terrible arithmetic is that these two failures multiplied each other. The doctrine said, you did not need the airplane. The politics said that even if you did, no one whose job it was would hurry. Put those together, and you get boys freezing at 25,000 feet with no one coming to help them, while the help sat proven and waiting on the far side of an ocean and an institution. I said at the beginning that the easy version of this story names a villain and moves on. I hope by now you see why I would not do that. There was no single villain. There was a theory that could not admit it was wrong, and a bureaucracy that could not love a child that was not its own, and the gap between them was measured in graves. As for the men in this story, the war did not hand out neat endings. Tommy Hitchcock, the man who saw it all so clearly and pushed so hard, did not live to see the full vindication of the airplane he had fought for. He wanted a real command, and he got one, working with the Mustang. In April of 1944, just as his airplane was clearing the skies over Germany, he was killed testing a Mustang in a high-speed dive over the English countryside. He never saw a D-Day. The man who understood the airplane's promise better and earlier than almost anyone died flying it, a few weeks before it delivered everything he had promised it would. Edgar Schmood, the quiet immigrant engineer who drew the thing, went on designing airplanes and largely stayed out of the legend, though the historian Ray Wagner would later give him his due in a biography called Mustang Designer. Doolittle, who set the fighters loose, is remembered mostly for the raid on Tokyo that carries his name, and less for the order that helped win the air war over Europe. And the crews, the ones who came before the Mustang and the ones who flew after, carried what they carried for the rest of their lives. I think about the men who flew those autumn 1943 missions most of all, the ones over Regensburg, over Schweinfurt, over the target on Black Thursday. They went out believing, because they had to believe, that they had been given everything their country could give them, and they had not. Through no fault of their own, and no fault of the men beside them, the thing that could have kept more of them alive existed already, and was not there. They paid the difference. They always do. It is almost always the people at the point of contact who pay for the comfort of the people who decide. If your father or your grandfather flew with the 8th Air Force in those hard months, in a bomber crew over Germany or in one of the fighter groups that finally reached out to cover them, I would genuinely like to hear about it. If someone in your family worked the flight line, turned wrenches on Allisons and Merlins, loaded the guns, filled the tanks, I want to hear that too. Those stories are the real record, and they matter more than anything I can read out of a book. Drop them in the comments. I read them, and so do a lot of the people watching alongside you. Here is where I come down, after all of it. The P-51 Mustang deserves every bit of its legend. It was the finest expression of what American industry and Allied cooperation could produce together, an American airframe and a British engine that did what neither could have done alone. But the legend is only half the story, and the half we usually skip is the one that actually costs something to remember. This airplane did not arrive late because it was hard to invent. It was already invented. It arrived late because a theory could not admit it was wrong, and a system could not be bothered to hurry for an orphan. The men who died in the gap were not killed by the enemy alone. They were killed, in part, by the distance between the answer and the will to use it. That distance is the oldest story in any large organization. And it is the one this channel exists to tell. Most of the time it costs money, or careers, or years. Here it cost lives by the thousands. And we know the exact airplane that could have changed the count. And we know it was ready, and we know when. That is the story. The sources are in the description. I will see you in the next one.